We will be waiting just a minute and then we will be starting. Oh. Making sure we have everything for the thank you to everyone who's signing in as participants. We will give it just a minute so that we'll get all the screen lined up properly and get started. Give us just a second. We're trying to get the right screen for everyone to see. Otherwise, we can go ahead and I can get started with my part.
Johnny, is that better? I'm sorry.
I still see just a big picture of Steph Van Pay, our tech person. So I know for the audience, the chat has been disabled. You can put things in the Q&A. So if any of you are seeing me as the main speaker for the moment, you can let me know in the Q&A. Oh, we can see you both. Okay, all right. And some people see just me. Great, thank you. Thank you. And I see names of people that I know, which is wonderful. Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead. I guess it's just our version here, which is not a problem. So I will be happy to get things started. So I want to welcome you to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. I'm Jenny Browngen. I am one of the teaching faculty at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work. I'm happy you're here today for this breakout session entitled Supporting Children of Color with Disabilities with Culturally Responsive Practices. In creating a more inclusive and accessible presentation and video, I'm providing a visual description of myself. I am an older white woman with shoulder-length red hair and brown framed glasses. I'm wearing a gray sweater today with hoop earrings and a necklace made of colorful beads. We are providing live captioning cart services, which are available by clicking the captioning icon. The presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website soon. On behalf of the Planning Committee for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging that our University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, here on the shores of Wangschick-Homslika, or Lake Mendota, resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place that they call Dejop, or Four Lakes. As the reach of the university extends to the far corners of our state, we are also respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you are watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations or you are more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land you are on. As social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in the attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, such as was the aim of boarding schools in this state and across this continent. This conference is rooted in critical reflection on our work as social workers. Our goal is to bring clarity about the past, but also to challenge and inspire us all to move into action in our work in communities once the conference is over. We hope this conference provides space for critical reflection, humility, and openness, which will allow us all to reflect, to hear and tell truths, and more to move towards action and transformation to support Indigenous rights, cultural equity, and racial equity. With acknowledgement and gratitude, we move forward today in our journey. Before I introduce our speaker, a few Zoom items. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email. This allows us to log our attendees and email you the information on CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted, but you do have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenter. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we will not be able to get to all the questions submitted, but we'll do our best. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. LaShorge Schaefer. Dr. Schaefer is an associate professor in early childhood special education at the University of Michigan Dearborn in the Department of Education. She attended the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she earned her doctorate in special education. Dr. Schaefer's research interests span across personnel preparation of professionals in both the educational and medical fields, serving young children at risk for disabilities and those with disabilities and their families, culturally responsive practices, social emotional development, challenging behavior, emotional behavioral disorders, policy issues, and professional development. For over 20 years, Dr. Schaefer has been engaged in teaching both young children and adults, mentoring, supervising, training, advising, evaluating, developing curriculum, evaluating courses, serving on advisory boards and committees, leading programs, engaging in research and dissemination. I'd like to welcome to Dr. Schaefer, and now we will change over for her to provide the keynote, and I'll be back at the very end with some closing reminders. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm going to start sharing my screen for everyone. And if you are not seeing this, just please let me know, and we can get that worked out. So I'm hoping everyone is capturing that. Is everyone able to see the screen? Jenny, can you let me know?
Yes, I can see it just fine. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. I'll go ahead and begin. So thank you for joining me, everyone, this afternoon here, and for us to really take some time to think about the practices that we use when we're working with young children and their families, specifically young children of color and children with disabilities. I'm really happy to be here with you among such an esteemed group of professionals. Social workers have such a great and direct impact on children and families and the work that you do, supporting them, providing them resources. And really, it's important that you are here during this time to really, I think, continue to enhance your skill set, your knowledge, and what you bring to the work that you do. So thank you. Our objectives today will be looking specifically at 4 out of the 7 of the uncommon core promising practices to really combat the impact of societal justices that impact children of color. We'll be specifically looking at some strategies to be able to effectively identify some variations that we come across the home, school, and community in respect to expectations that we as practitioners have, and how to support families in helping develop their children's social emotional development and be preventative of challenging behavior. We also want to be able to understand the impact that having nurturing, responsive, and supportive environments, relationships in children's overall development, and how that can change the trajectory of kids. And finally, we're going to turn to you as a professional and really look at your own wellness and supports in order to prevent any burnout and stress. And so when we think about the topic that we are coming into today, one of the things that may question is, why is it important? Well, I want to set the stage with a framework that's based on evidence and based on research that's been done. And we know that when young kids have an opportunity to be able to adapt to environments in order for them to be able to function and to be able to learn, specifically early on in early childhood classrooms, that is a predictor of later school success. And so being able to have that influence at a younger age when we're working with kids really change that trajectory for them. Also looking at the systems that impact children in and of itself is important. So we must recognize what those systems are. We are part of that system. There are many systems across our society that are impacting children, but we have to recognize them and know what are some of those inequities within the system that can impact their overall growth and development. Then we need to think about how we look at and report the need for supports to address any type of externalizing behaviors of concern that is usually indicated from professionals that are working with them, usually mainly that's teachers, looking at that data. And then finally thinking about how can we identify practices and strategies that are culturally responsive in order to support children. So I want us to start off with looking at some data, of course, specifically on the preschool suspension and expulsion that has been gathered from several researchers. We know that there's a higher percentage of children that are being expelled and suspended from preschool. And those individual children were African American. And when we look at the data even closer, we recognize that children who are specifically African American, like I said, and boys are 91% more likely to be suspended. That really is stark compared to the number of children that are represented within enrollment in programs, which doesn't correlate to the number of those kiddos that are being suspended. And so when we also break that down even more for children with disabilities, who represent about 20% of preschool enrollment, 15% of those children are receiving one or more out of school suspensions. And that's preschool. That's even before they are entering into quote unquote formal schooling of kindergarten and first grade and above. And so if that's starting that pattern for them, what is it going to look like for those kids as they continue to progress in school? And how is that going to impact the work that we are doing with them? And so I wanted us to take a moment as we're starting to watch a video. It's about 3 minutes long, that shares with us the preschool to prison pipeline and what the impact that it's having on schools and families that are presented within these schools.
Can you rhyme? So if I say cat in the house,
4-year-old JJ and his 3-year-old brother Joa are doing what children their age do. Running and playing 1 minute, pushing the next. When they act up at home, they are disciplined.
I think that they're typical 4 and 3-year-olds.
But at school,
He's been suspended about 5 times. 3 at 3. And I can't make this up. I wish I was. He hit one of the teachers on the arm and they sent him home. And they said that they considered that hitting to be a danger to the staff.
the most recent report says 7,500 children nationwide were suspended at least once from public preschool. Yes, preschool. The alarming numbers reported by the Department of Education also say Black students are being suspended and expelled at a rate 3 times greater than white kids across all grades.
We know there is a correlation between doing out-of-school suspensions and expulsions and ultimately locking kids up. For far too many children and communities, the school to prison pipeline is real. And the fact starts as young as 4, again, simply isn't good enough.
In Los Angeles, America's second largest school district, Superintendent John Dacey finds the trend disturbing.
Why are these numbers playing out this way? Ma'am, I think they're the same biases that are in society. And so I think this is a reflection of the growth we have yet to do in this country around these issues.
What shocked him? The reason. The majority of suspensions in his district were for something called willful defiance.
It was things like failure to do homework, failure to bring your notebook to class. That's not willful defiance, that's adolescence.
A year ago, the district became the first in the nation to remove willful defiance as a reason for suspensions. And the numbers have dropped ever since. 3 years ago, there were 19,000 suspensions. This year, 8,000. The teachers union never took a stance on the issue, with some teachers saying willful defiance has been abused, and others saying it takes an important disciplinary tool away from the classrooms.
I teach my kids all the time, education is your passport.
Jeanette Powell learned that the hard way. Long before her sons were born, she was labeled a troublemaker. As the daughter of a drug-addicted father, she struggled in school and life.
I was expelled from school when I was 3 years old in preschool. And when I first got the phone call about JJ, I immediately thought back to that. You know, at a young age, I was told that I was a bad kid in school.
Jeanette proved them wrong, eventually got her college degree, wrote a book, and became an accomplished public speaker, even giving a TED Talk.
Get behind the line.
The Powells have worked hard to make a good life for their children.
My biggest fear is that they'll be labeled and that they'll believe it.
Every day, she fights to inspire her boys more a preschool to pre-med mentality. In preschool to prison. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Omaha.
Can you rhyme?
So that video is just one example of, the impact that, suspension and expulsion is having on a child, a family, a school district, but it's happening across the United States. It's happening to many, many families. And so one of the things that we have recognized is that looking at data from 1995 to around 2001, there has been a 36% to a 42% increase of children from high-risk environments. And these children are even more likely to experience preschool expulsion and suspension. And we know that it stems from this idea of challenging behavior and subjectively identifying what that is. And so even like the willful defiance that the superintendent reported within that news clip, that's something in and of itself that increases the likelihood of a child being suspended and expelled from school. And so if that's happening to children beginning at the age of 2 or 3 when they're entering preschool, and it continues to have an impact on them, for even longer time, as you saw in the video with the mom reflecting back on her time is being expelled. And so we're looking at some of these, factors that, increase the likelihood that professionals and or teachers are setting kids up for expulsion and suspension. And some of those causes, as you see here, is, job stress, lack of preparation, lack of professional development, not having those mental health supports, their class sizes, and of course, implicit bias. And so some of the recommendations when we look at them is to really think about is how can we proactively address children's emotional and behavioral needs and being able to support teachers as well in order to combat this phenomena that's happening for this community. The next thing that I want to share with you is what has been identified as the pandemic effect. Of course, we have moved, quote unquote, out of COVID, but research was conducted during this time, and even prior to that, really looking at, the impact that, any type of psychological impacts on the health of the family and children, any health-related disasters such as the pandemic, any economic stressors have on children and families. Also looking at anxiety, young children have been known to have anxiety and also depression, especially when their family has been exposed to different types of trauma and or related to any type of public health crisis. And then finally looking at the last research that is presented here is looking at some of those protective factors that may not be in place in order to be able to support families that are going through increased demands on stress. And so there's many things that are happening within communities and environments that impact families. And some of the data that was shared through the rapid assessment and of pandemic impact on development and early childhood team from the University of Oregon shows some, concerns that families had pre-pandemic and during the pandemic as well. And as you can see, the lighter colored red bar shows that care and education wasn't as a higher concern pre-pandemic, but during the pandemic, that concern raised. And then when we look at the exclusion of children from their environments, that during the pandemic, that was increased as well. And so we really have to look at the voices from families that are shared during research and really thinking about how is that going to change the trajectory of our practices that we utilize with families. But this study really, really wanted to present the voices of families, which I think is so important and many times not often heard through research that we present. But as you can see documented here, that there are concerns that families have, and it's important for us to be responsive to those concerns. Going along the same lines of the pandemic, really thinking about how we've all been exposed to trauma from the pandemic in of itself. But when we specifically look at the definition of childhood trauma, one of the things that we have presented that as any type of abuse and or neglect that the child has been exposed to in family violence, school violence, life-threatening accidents, discrimination, separation from their parents, and extreme poverty. And so all of these things you may have seen or come across in the work that you do working with children and families, and just knowing that being exposed to this on a continual basis, how that's going to impact the child long term, and what that does to them as they are coming into our environments and the work that we do. And so I have another video that I want to share with you that presents, again, the trauma that this young child has went through and how it's impacting the community, and really gets us to, again, think about so many things that kids are exposed to at such a young age, and how we are going to be able to support them when they have these experiences.
What's next? Yes, it's also helping the community. Give it a point. Hey, I'm doing out there, people. A lot of people look at me and say he can't be God. I feel with God. I believe what thus said the Lord. I study the word from Genesis to Revelation. But y'all know me. Y'all know I lost my 6-year-old son, King Carter, through the senseless gun violence. We march today by peace and love, but we know truth. We know what truth means. We know how God is. You feel what I'm saying? So don't be looking at me just because y'all see goals and tattoos and thinking God can't move within me. You feel what I'm saying? It's a lot of people with suits and ties and nice shoes. And on that note, I dress better than y'all in y'all suits. I got a whole closet full of that. I just go out there like this because this is what the kids relate to. I'm from the gutter, from the projects. So when I visit the foster homes, the youth jail houses, the daycare, the middle schools, don't judge me. I ain't getting $1 for what I put in. I wake up every morning and ask the Lord to search me from the root of my feet to the crown of my head and work me. You feel what I'm saying? Straight out this village, I want these projects. I found my only son dead in the cold. Y'all know the story. 6 years old, King Carter.
Can't even imagine what this guy was going through. I mean, King Carter was my son's age. I'm 6 years old, and he got caught in the middle of a gunfight between some teenagers. And it happened right here in Miami Gardens.
He said, Daddy, give me $1 to go to the candy store. He gave me $3. He was walking from right here to that tree. heard every shot, heard the shot that took my son out of the game. But my son ain't lost, Trayvon ain't lost. When you lose something, you can't go back and find it. You have no sense of where it's at. I know my son in heaven. I know Trayvon in heaven. I know Jada Page in heaven. So how can we say we lost them? You feel what I'm saying? God got him here. But like I say, I'm gonna do what I do. I'm gonna stand out here for these kids, and it's deeper than my music. A lot of people say, how he do music and he's still doing it? It can be forgetting my music just for these kids. And that's on God. A lot of people like to look at me and judge me, and they ain't doing nothing for the kids. They ain't giving no money in the community. They ain't going out here preaching and pulling these kids out of bad. I could go in every drug hole, go talk to every killer in Miami and say, bro, what you doing, bro? Don't you see these kids out here? But a lot of politicians won't step in them spots. They won't do what I'm doing, but they judge me. But they judge Antonio Carter. Y'all know him for y'all. I love baby one of y'all. Long live Trayvon. Long live King Carter.
Listening to these stories, it makes me think of my little brother. Say you never get over it. It's always there, but I'm trying to move on. I cannot keep taking all these, our young family members, you know, it's, when is it gonna stop? You know, everybody was black one on the shelf. No. You like to blame blame. You know, black man, you don't even know. But
Sad to have a child that got to experience that type of pain. I mean, kids aren't supposed to know death like that, you know, and for them to have experienced that pain like that early, it's just heartbreaking. So we have to keep light shining on these situations at all times as much as possible.
So the videos that I showed, you would identify them as probably, many of you may have heard of adverse childhood experiences, or what we call ACEs. And it impacts the brain, it impacts our bodies, it impacts the behavior that we see in young children and adults as they are continuing to be exposed to that. And so what we have to really think about is, you know, overarching where this is impacting young children and how it can continue to manifest itself as they get older. And so having, again, impacting the brain, thinking about that anxiety, that depression that takes place. We see unintended pregnancies, we see exposure to HIV and other STDs. We see things that, you know, they are engaging in any type of risky behavior, such as drugs and alcohol. And then, you know, the opportunities that are taken away because of the lasting effects, the adverse effects of these adverse childhood experiences. And so, you know, with, you know, this in mind, the suspension, exposure, these ACEs that have really seemed to consume our society and our educational system, really thinking about what approach that we can take in order to be able to support them. So one that you may have heard of is trauma-informed care and supports. And there's 4 things that really help us to be able to move forward in this work, especially if you have this trauma-informed lens, is really realizing that there's a widespread impact of trauma, and really understand that how that exposure can impact someone and what needs to be put in place for recovery. Recognizing those signs and symptoms of trauma in the families that we're working with, the children, our colleagues that we're working with, staff that are in these systems that we're working in. And then being able to respond by really taking the opportunities to inform ourselves and become more knowledgeable about trauma. What are some policies and practices that are in place within the agencies and the systems, the schools that we may be working in? And then, try to put forth a barrier, right? In order to be able to resist being re-traumatized. And so not having, ongoing exposure to the trauma, but building a resiliency in order to be able to continue to move beyond what has happened, like we saw in the first video with the mom, and being able to change that outcome for one's life. And so in order to effectively address the social, overarching emotional development, we need to really think about it as a systems issue. And my monitor is hoping it'll jump back in for you. I just love technology. Okay, so hopefully let me start my screen sharing back up again. We can stop. All right. Forward, I apologize. There we go. So if we think about it as a systems issue, we have to think about the staff development, again, training and their wellness, what administrative supports that we have within our programs. How are we supporting communities, having access community and that community-based expertise and their resources as well. And a lot of times, we forget about the resources and the expertise that communities bring. They know their communities. And so it's important for us to really reach out to communities and really think about also what are some of the best ways that we can partner with them in order to support the children and the families that we're working with as we're engaging with. And so that brings us in really thinking about culture and how can we equip ourselves with understanding culture and the dynamics of culture that takes place within the communities. And so if we look at this quote from Barrera, it's like the purpose of recognizing culture and cultural dynamics is not to predict or anticipate. It is rather to become open and respectful to diverse behaviors, even when these are outside our own areas of familiarity. And so the speaker in the last video, King Carter, Mr. Carter, are we open to what he can bring to us as a partner? Are we respectful enough for the experiences that he has had in being able to support the community that he's working hard to change as well? And so really thinking about ways that we approach our work and who we approach our work with And are we open to diverse backgrounds and experiences and that varying individuals come with? And are we respectful of those experiences as well? And so we, really want to think about who is being impacted in our communities and how we can work hand in hand with others in order to change the impact that that has on them. And so that leads us to, being culturally responsive and thinking about the practices and strategies. And so if we are open and we are respectful to the many, many, many resources and partners that we can have, then we can build our own cultural responsivity to this work. And so now we're going to really think about what are we talking about when we're talking about culturally responsive practices, and what does that look like for us? And in and of itself is the application, right, of practices and strategies that acknowledges the cultural heritage of children. Really thinking about, the experiences that they have, their dispositions, their attitudes that they come to us with, right? And really thinking about how we can utilize that within the context of the curriculum that we do, that we're working with them, or interventions that we're utilizing, and how to bridge the home and school or organization experience that we have when we're working with children and their families, especially with the younger the children are. We should be partnering with their families. And so our culturally responsive professionals should be looking at their work from these characteristics, embodying these characteristics and these practices, thinking, from a sociocultural consciousness, being able to think of themselves as change agents and being able to have an impact on or with the children, the families, and communities they're working with. Being able to cultivate one's own knowledge regarding the children, the students that you're working with. Are we coming to our work with an affirming attitude within the work? Are we looking at it from a social constructivist perspective, and then adding into that a cultural responsive teaching in what we do? And so we'll take a look at each one of these practices in a little bit more depth in order to identify what these look like. And so when we're talking about sociocultural consciousness, are we able to critically self-reflect upon our own culture? Do we understand our own culture and where we come from? Are we able to identify these institutional dynamics that have a negative impact on the children, the families, and the communities that are we working with? Are we identifying the societal inequalities that are continually to take place and or to be added to our communities that are having a negative impact on the children and families we're working with? And do we acknowledge the cultural conflicts and the negative perceptions that are out there that is impeding the positive outcomes of certain cultural and ethnic groups that we work with? And so are we constantly being reflective of all of these in the work that we do? When we're sitting at a table with our colleagues, when we overhear maybe some phrases or conversations that individuals are having, when we are making decisions, not just for ourselves, but for others in the work that we do. Are we coming to that work with a social cultural consciousness in what we do? And that's something that is not always innate in what we do, but it's something that we have to build upon. And that cultural reflection is something that should be ongoing. It's not like, oh, well, I know who I am, I don't need to think about it. Or some I've heard individuals say, I don't have a culture. And that is definitely untrue for each and every one of us. We all come to this work from some cultural background and lived experience. And so we have to recognize that. And in order to move forward in this work. Sociocultural constructivism is a philosophical perspective rooted from Piaget and Vygotsky that believes that children develop when provided a learning environment that is authentic, that is student-centered, that allows children to construct their own knowledge, that allows for interactive learning to take place. It allows for situated learning to take place within the context of the activities that they're engaging in, which embeds culture within those activities. It's for a perspective that provides support to children, providing scaffolding, guiding them, and being able to understand what's happening in the world around them. It provides an opportunity for kids to be able to, plan and integrate their understanding of the world and the learning that they are engaging in. And it provides opportunities for kids to build upon their own pre-existing knowledge and allowing them to share ideas, providing them opportunities to work within the context of groups and individually. And so there's a lot that goes on within this philosophy in order for us to be able to really, really think about the many different ways in order to help children develop and grow. And thinking about, what does it mean to help kids cultivate, their own understanding of themselves in this work. And so we have to also be able to cultivate our own knowledge regarding the children we're working with, the families that we're working with in the community. And knowing that it takes time, but also being able to think about who can share this knowledge with us in order for us to build our knowledge, in order for us to help build children as well. And so thinking about, again, family members, thinking about those experts in the community, it's going to take time for kids to learn about, what it is that interests them, both, in school when they're new to school environments and as we're working with them, but also really thinking about, what is it that interests them outside of that. That's also something that we have to tap into. And as we're cultivating our own knowledge regarding the children that we're working with, it's not just understanding and knowing what interests them in the school, but outside of the school. And so that takes time for us to really build that knowledge and that information through questions that we ask children and families regarding what are their interests, what do they enjoy doing, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. When we continue to build on our practices, we want to think about, are we supporting children's identity development through their cultural heritage, through getting an opportunity to participate in diverse learning that's taken place within the context of their educational environment? Do we have our own disposition of inclusiveness and being able to think about the different abilities and the different learning styles of the children that we are working with? And so we have to really take the whole child within the context of developing, interventions and activities that we want to engage them in, and place that also within the context of that child's culture, their home, their school, and their overarching community. And so we have to really think about our approach being inclusive, being responsive, and being caring in order to develop and help develop the young children that we're working with. And so in doing so, we are empowering students themselves within this work when we are taking all this within the context of the work that we do in our engagement and our interactions that we have with children and families. And so, Jeannie, I want to take a quick moment to ask if there are any questions that have been posed that that I should be aware of.
There was one question that had come up earlier that was asking about your data, said that, what is the reason that education concern was the only thing that was increased during the pandemic? Is it due to school being online or that other categories dropped? Or do you know any more about that particular data?
Yeah, that was just one data point that I pulled out from that article. When I share the handouts that I have from the PowerPoint and the links, you'll be able to see that full report. But there was economic concerns, there were health concerns that families voiced concerns about. And so education was just one of the data charts that I presented.
Oh, thank you. That was the only main question that had, except for that, we'll let everybody know that your slides and materials will be shared later on. And we will be letting people know whether it'll be a link right on our website or whether it will be an email, but people will know either way. But yes, they will be getting all of your information. And so, okay, otherwise, that was it for the questions at this point.
Okay, wonderful. So as we move forward and we're thinking about this, I want us to move into this idea of pedagogy of empathy. And that is, another aspect of being culturally responsive that we should take into consideration in the work that we do. And so when we think about empathy, it's this idea of perspective taking. And it has been, looked at from Davis as that tendency to spontaneously, so as quickly adopting the psychological point of view of others in everyday life. And so to be able to do that, one must really, I think, build the capacity in doing that. And so I just have an image here that, you can think about what quickly comes to your mind of what you see within this image. And so next, if I change it, what image do you see from this perspective? And so the first one you may have saw, a bird with something in its mouth, maybe a worm, maybe a nut or something. But from the second image, you may be like, oh, there's a man in a canoe off a small island and he's pulling in a big fish. But it's that perspective taking that we really need to take into consideration and really think about relating it to another person's life experiences and point of view. And so a lot of times what we see on the surface level is only part of a situation. And it's really not until we dig deeper or we look deeper that we see another person's full experience that they're having. And what we're seeing that's manifesting at the surface is because of what has happened prior to that. And that's something that perspective taking challenges us to do in order for us to really, instead of, imagining the other, imagining the self, and really being able to ask ourselves these questions of, what is life like for that person? What might be influencing how, they are perceiving this situation that we can't see right now? And how can I relate to their experiences to really understand how they feel about that? And so perspective taking is something that really, really presents us, understanding how others are thinking, how others are feeling, and that knowledge that they bring to that situation or their experiences that they have. And it's really important for us to really think about all the hidden influences that we may not see ourselves, but to ask ourselves those questions of, how is this situation impacting that individual from these different lenses that they are bringing forth to the situation. And so that application of empathy really is a way for us to adopt, within the work that we do, within the perspectives that we have, by integrating students' lived experiences, family lived experiences, and by asking them those questions, by really asking children, because they can many times articulate what's happening in and around them, asking their families about what's happening. And so understanding the communities, really thinking about, what it is that continues to impact them in their overall development. Thinking about both the political, again, and the historical context that are taking place and continue to take place. And, how can we take that perspective of the other individual that we are working with in order for us to be able to be responsive to that. Next, I want us to talk about the opportunity gap that we have seen. And this really goes back into this, the understanding of enrollment and expulsion of children. And so the Office of Civil Rights, as I showed you, shows that the percentage of preschool enrollment of Black children was 18%. However, the male preschool suspensions is 45%. And we might wonder, like, how can that be? And again, it's the perspectives, I think, of the individuals that are putting those referrals in place for that expulsion. But this provides us, I think, an opportunity for us to really think about development and learning of children, for us to really think about racism and poverty, the school challenges that children are facing, and that professionals and educators are facing, and then really thinking about being able to educate, the educators. And when I say educators, I mean all that work with children on a day-to-day basis. And so that's many, many people within the context, specifically of school systems, whether it is a reading specialist, a speech language pathologist, a social worker, a school counselor. And so there are many, many educators that work with children throughout their educational career. And so as we look at development and learning, we really want to make sure that are we thinking about things that are culturally specific to children's overall development and learning. That could be the language that that individual child speaks, their first language, the language that's spoken at home. And are we integrating that within the learning and development experiences that we're providing them? Are we thinking about the relationships that that child has, both at home and at school? And are those relationships safe? Are they responsive? And how do children enter into the relationships with us, and how that's going to impact our work? We also need to think about children's basic and psychological needs, and whether those are being met. And, can we be responsive to those needs if they're not being met? And that may mean that we're not just, making assumptions on our own, but again, talking to other team members, talking with families regarding these. Are we creating environments that are high quality, that are culturally responsive for young children? And really trying to identify, what does that mean for a high quality, culturally responsive environment? And what's not a high quality environment, and how can we create one in order to be able to support kids? And then really thinking about how we can strengthen young kids' self-efficacy and self-identity as we're working with. The next opportunity for us to think about, like I said before, is racism and poverty. 38% of African American children specifically live below the poverty line. We know that communities are segregated. The resources that are in those communities are less, which means that the schools don't have those resources, and then the neighborhoods don't have the resources. And so there's many communities that are identified as being food deserts, meaning that there are no grocery stores in those communities, and being able to access a grocery store is something that can be a strain for families. And so really thinking about, you know, how the children and the families and the communities they live in are being impacted by the resources that are not being put within those communities. Also recognizing that there are remnants of slavery that are present within specifically African-American children. And there are other communities that also are living with remnants of atrocities that have happened to them in the past as well. And are we recognizing that? Are we thinking about that that's something that is continuing to impact that individual family, that community, and that child? And so being able to recognize that and really think about the impact that that's having on a child is really important. The denial of culture and language within itself. And so when we are refusing to allow children to be able to develop their language, to be able to recognize their culture within, outside of their home and or the community. So can that be brought within to the schools that we're working with? And then again, that exposure to that toxic stress and or extreme violence or extreme neglect, and how that seems to continue to present itself within communities and individuals who have been marginalized in the past. Next, again, those school challenges, we know that there is a culture gap that are within the school, as we know that there are more and more educators that have grown up, specifically female, that have grown up to become teachers. The majority of individuals that are in our profession, educational profession, including, again, social workers and speech language pathologists and occupational therapists, are women. And predominantly it's occupied by white women. And knowing that the change in demographics has shifted, how has that impacted the response when individuals are working with children that are not of the same cultural background as them? We also look at some of the other data, that's presented in the middle box regarding that, again, that expulsion rate prior to entering kindergarten. And then, the data also has been presented by Gilliam, is really looking at, boys and expulsion rate that are Latino, Caucasian, African-American, from Asian background, but also that expulsion rate of children across gender, and also children with disabilities. And so really thinking about how we can address these school challenges. And I'm bringing you back to, the picture of that video, this video, in order for us to remember the long-term impact that preschool exposure has on kids and their families. And so if we are thinking about continuing to educate ourselves, and it's a continual journey, which is why there are conferences and webinars and additional professional development and ongoing education that we receive, we have to think about how are we balancing our teaching approaches, our interventions, in order to meet the needs of the children that we're working with. Are we integrating and balancing that curriculum? Are we being critical of the curriculum that's put forth in front of us, and really thinking about whether or not it's culturally responsive to the children that we're working with, and how can we make sure that we can add our culturally responsive practices and resources to the curriculum that we are utilizing with children. And then really thinking about building these higher order thinking skills with within ourselves and with the children that we're working with. And so if we think about, the child that we're working with, we have to think about the many variables that are impacting them, right? We see here that the child is impacted by, health, play, their environment, the instruction, their home and family, recreational events and activities, their friends, and other interactions that we have. And so, some of the things that we have to think about is like how these overall impact the development of the child. And, we have to think about these many, many variables, and there are also maybe others that are not even listed here, in which are going to impact their child's growth and overall development. And so we have to be able to ask, again, multiple questions of families, of the partners that we're working with, of, other agencies, and really thinking about, how are all of these being responded to in order to be able to support the child the child of color in the communities. So next, we are going to move into some of the uncommon core practices. And the first uncommon core practice that I want to present to you is that idea of partnering with families. And so you might be saying that, that's not something that's new and or unfamiliar, but looking at it from a culturally responsive perspective is something that I'm hoping will add to your the work that you do. And so we should recognize that there are differences that are in the expectations from the home, from the school, and even from society. And so it's important that we know that others may not share the same experiences, the same knowledge base, and the same expectations for children. And so that there are going to be those differences in the expectations from the school system and from what children have experienced at home. It's really important for us to note that the more closely matched that teachers' expectations are to what is expected of the child at the home, that the more likely we're going to have more success for that child in their outcomes. And I should put a note in here or a caveat that the photos of the children that you see or the young man that you see is photos of my son. And so he is not this young anymore, he's 21. And so these are some captions that to really get us for me to continue to think about the experiences that he's had, that I've had, and the work that I've had when I'm working with children within the classroom, and how that impacts my work even today and ongoing. And so some factors that can impact the work that we do when we're partnering with family is communication. And there's some things that can cause differences in the communication styles that we have that are unique and different to each and every one of us. But some of those things are one's ethnicity, the gender, their socioeconomic status, one's age, their sexual orientation, their religious background, their access to varying communicative devices and or how they are communicating with us. And so these are some of the factors that we should take into consideration, that we may notice that there is a mismatch even within our communication styles. Also, some of the things we should think about is that continuum of communication that is out there. When we think about communication, are we thinking about it from a collectivist approach that many communities have embodied within just their system and way of being? Or is it from an individualist perspective? Is our communication style low versus high? Is the one that we're communicating with more silent than maybe I'm a very talkative communicator? And so where are we at on understanding with our partners, where they're at communicatively. And so if I'm just focusing on the child and I'm working with a family who's thinking about how this is going to impact them as a family, my individualistic communication approach is not going to match their collectivist thinking of their family. And it might be even an extended family that they're thinking of when they're talking about their family. So it's really important for us to really understand our communicative partners that we're working with and where they're at on this continuum. Communication is really, really key for us to have effective partnerships with families, and in a few slides we are going to look at that. But it's important that we think about our own communication style, how we behave when we're communicating with others, our biases, and how others communicate with us, and dimensions that could differ from others. And so it's important that once we identify our own communication style, that we really try to think about how we can improve how we communicate with others more effectively. And so thinking about what strategies and skills do we need in order to maybe match the communication styles of others. So when we're trying to create this climate and this partnership with families, one of the things that we have to think about is, when is that going to begin? So when do we start that communication and that partnership? And we want us to be beginning that as soon as services begin. And so whether it's through a letter or an email, home visit, or a phone call, we want to make sure that that introduction of, of ourselves and our work and what we're bringing to support the child and family, what is that? And so we, immediately once we have that child and family on our caseload, we want to think about, okay, well, services begin, the first day of school or a certain date that you've set for. And so are we inviting parents in? Are we making phone calls? Are we providing opportunities to meet and have conversations? Are we finding out what parents are thinking with the work that we'll be doing with their child? And so really thinking about what does that look like, and what is it that we need to do in order to be able to effectively communicate with the children and the families that we're working with. And in that, we should be thinking about, are we identifying the knowledge that families are bringing culturally in and of itself, but also, the knowledge that maybe they do not have as well within the services that we are bringing. And so it's what we call cultural capital, and that funds of knowledge and experiences that enable one to be able to understand and negotiate with the mainstream culture. And so that would be, I'm identifying mainstream culture as the work that we do, like the social service work that we do in the field that we're in. If I'm presenting my intervention and my approach to families and they don't have that information to really understand the work that I'm doing and why it's important and to providing their child that support, then that also can maybe impact that relationship. It can impact the work that we're doing in the partnership that we're trying to build. So it's really important for us to be able to not just assume that families know what the work that we're engaging in, but also the why, and if they have any questions, and really thinking about how we can be responsive to them within a cultural context. We want to make sure that our communication is intentional with families. We want to really think about what information that needs to be shared, what developmental and educational goals we're hoping to be able to help with their support, help their child to achieve. We want to be able to share with them that if there's any questions that they have, if there's any requests that they are putting forth, that they can reach out to us, and we have that open communication. We want to be able to utilize our problem solving skills, because we won't agree with everything when we are working with parents regarding the, maybe the intervention and the plans that we have when we're working with their children. And so we want to be able to problem solve through that in order to be able to best meet the needs and the goals of the child. When we are communicating with parents, we want to really be able to understand the parent's point of view of their child. One of the things that we utilize a lot within education is what we've, and I maybe heard of it, is the compliment sandwich technique. And starting out your conversation with, a positive, and then your areas of concerns are the middle of that sandwich, and then you're ending with, again, something that's positive. And so really thinking about how you are constructing your conversations with families, and it's not just, you've reached out to communicate them for something that's negative. Recognizing that mistakes are part of life, and is in order for us to learn, and in order for children to learn, the mistakes, they happen, and we learn from them. And so parents make mistakes too. They're not perfect. And so it's really important for us to really be able to support them through this partnership that we're building. Because our ultimate goal is to be able to help the children that we're working with. And I want to ask Jenny about our time in order for me to determine. This video is about 9 minutes. So I want to be able to make sure that
Yes, it is 4:11. And so it goes, I'm sorry, 3:11, so that we have another 20 minutes. We
Okay.
did have a couple other questions.
Okay.
Did you want me to read those off to you before you move? Because I know the last couple of videos were really hard to see. We might need to, or hear, actually, it was the hard part, just to keep that in mind. But
Okay.
I will read off both questions, and then you can see what would be the best to start with. One was asking, are there any new or innovative practices or applications of empathy in school that you're particularly excited about? So that would be looking at the empathy issue. Then, do you find that families are not communicating back even when we reach out? How do we get them past their own childhood trauma related to their disrespected culture enough to participate in possibly a better and new, more culturally aware process? So one to do with that, about how to keep connecting even when the families are have had bad experiences in the past.
So with the first question regarding perspective taking and empathy, I think it kind of ties into the second question as well. And having this period of time that we have been isolated, many people are more looking inward of themselves and how everything has impacted them. And so as we are trying to re-enter society in a way that we did before, that's not going to, I think, primarily work. I think, really expressing our understanding of the experiences and acknowledging, again, those experiences that individuals have in an authentic way, as opposed to a passive way. It's like, oh, yes, yeah, we all did that. But for some people, these last, 2 and 3 years, coupled with the community experiences they've had, has really put them in a place of mistrust. And I think that can add into the second question, is that, do I trust you? Right? There's a lot of mistrust that's out there of, the educational system, just because of, children not receiving the services that they needed during the pandemic, not being able to reach the professionals outside of the Zoom, quote unquote, time that they have. And so there's, building the relationship and building that trust is going to take probably even more time than it has in the past. Because again, this isn't just a one-time moment that this has happened, but it seems that it's continuing on, especially with so many different violent, activities that are happening in communities and in schools as well. And so families are, I think, guarded at this time. I know there are some professionals who are also guarded, and makes it really hard to continue to reach out over and over and over again, and taking that extra step, sometimes outside of school hours or quote unquote work hours, in order to be able to reach families and or meet their needs. And so that idea of, what can we do really quickly? I think it's really, again, taking that time to tap into the community, not only just from an outward look, but within that school, and like what's happening within the school community and that home school connection and relationship, that we can, really build that trust again in order to be able to get parents and families to be responsive to us, in order so we can meet the needs of their children. Because what we're finding is that their experiences that they've had and that's ongoing, we're seeing that manifesting in the children. And that in order for us to be able to work, into supporting kids, we're going to have to reach the families as well, in order to get services in place. And so I know that's not a quick answer that one may have been looking for, but I do believe that it's going to take time in order to rebuild that trust between us as professionals and the families in the schools, within the schools that we're working with.
Thank
So
you.
I'm going to, yes,
Yeah.
no problem.
Yeah, yeah, the
Yep.
time, we have a little over maybe 12 minutes left, and so we have time for the wrap up. And
Yep.
then definitely, I know that the persistence that we need to have with families and kind of changing different approaches is definitely time consuming, but it's
Mhm.
what we need to do to connect up with the families. So thank you. Those are the only two questions right now. So then it would be the way that I'll let you know when we just down to just a couple minutes.
Okay, wonderful. So some things as we're thinking about, some thoughts to keep in mind is, we are continue to advocate, for the work that we do on behalf of children and families, especially I think children with disabilities, children that we know that are most at risk for having to be impacted by everything that is going on. And so we need to really, as this quote says, that, it's such a critical part of the promotion of multicultural values. And many families do not feel that they're valued. And so it's for us to really think about them, are we, understanding the cultural perspective of the families that we're working with to make sure that it's accurate. We want to continue to build and maintain the support in order for us to be able to support the learning and the growth and development of children that we're working with. And so we have to continue to be reminded of the urgency of the work that we do in order for us to support the children that we're working with. And so this goes into our next uncommon core, is looking at how our environments are set up for children as well. And so again, I talked about that learning gap between the current teachers that we have and the children that we're working with, and how that is manifesting itself within the expulsion that's happening. And so one of the things we need to think about are our environments. And so are we being responsive to boys while being authoritative instead of authoritarian? And so we think about different parenting styles that are out there. That's specifically what I am referring to. And how are we diffusing situations if we haven't really taken into perspective of the children that we are working with? Do we talk within a private manner, or do we call kids, quote unquote, out when they are engaging in behavior we have determined and deemed intolerable. Making sure we're avoiding threatening kids, making sure that we, really try to follow through on what we say we're going to do, and making sure that it's consistent across all kids. We want to make sure we're talking with, all children, but specifically boys, about their emotions, and making sure that they understand how to respond to their emotions that they're having in a nonviolent and non-threatening way. We want to be able to help, all children manage their impulses, for boys as well. Being able to foster, emotional connectiveness to the community, so their classroom community, their school community, and their family. Being able to nurture and foster that is something that is important. We also need to make sure we're thinking about our expectations of children, and having high expectations of kids is so important. And so when kids were in that state of being, remote, that's something that really seemed to have shifted. And so we want to make sure that that is something that's not continuing to go on and being endured over a long term. And so we want to be able to think about the holistic needs of all kids and providing them, again, with those best environments for development and engagement. And really, again, setting our expectations high, and thinking about children and what their interests are. And so we know that the research that children love to investigate, they love to discover new things, they need to communicate. So when we're silencing children, then we are not meeting their needs. We want to make sure we're providing them opportunities for engaging in artistic expression and in construction as well, and being able to show their creativity, and for us to be able to value that creativity that kids are presenting to us, and allowing them to and for us to challenge them in order for us to be able to help to continue to build their curiosity about learning, about the world around them. And so these are some of the things that we can do, to help create these environments that are going to support kids. Making sure we again allow children to talk, asking those questions, knowing that curiosity is a sign of that child's intellectual power and helps to increase their knowledge. And so it's important, again, we don't silence children when they have questions. We want to make sure that there are spaces and places where children can develop their thinking skills, and create opportunities for open conversations and discussions, and help kids develop those democratic values in order to help them to be able to thrive and be successful in their ongoing education and in their communities lifelong. We want to help to allow kids to be open and courteous with their communication engagement, and then helping them to develop resolution and conflict resolution skills. So kids are going to be nervous, they're going to be excited, they're going to be anxious, they're going to be filled with questions when they're coming to our spaces, and we need to be able to adjust to that. We many times may come into a space and our head's not in. And so, but we need to make sure that we are reflective of where we're at in the time that we're working with kids, and so we can be our best and present our best foot forward for them, because they take note of that. They take note of whether or not we are ready to be engaged with them. One of the things that we need to recognize is our influence that we have on kids' identity. If we put garbage in them, then garbage is going to come out. And so going back to King Carter and the little boy Robert, I know it was hard to hear that video, but one of the things he was saying is that I'm constantly being told I'm stupid, I'm no good, that I'm not going to be anything. That's garbage that we are giving kids. And so what are they supposed to really think about their own self-identity and their self-esteem? We're supposed to be building that up. If we're not presenting that to them, then we're tearing them down. And so their opinion about their own confidence, their control, their own self-worth is presented through our society. And, we're one aspect of that. There's many things that we're fighting against that, that they have access to, videos and games, so on and so forth. And so cartoons even. And so we really need to think about our influence and how we have these other outside influences that we are fighting against. Any negative data that kids are constantly receiving is going to build negative self-esteem. So we have to think about how can we help build the self of the child. And so that's one of the next common core practices I want us to think about, that focuses on that social, emotional behavior support. We want to really break down the self-awareness, their self-concept, their self-control, and their self-esteem in order for us to support constructing, a positive and affirming individual of itself. And so many of you, I'm sure you know this already within the context of the social work that you're doing. And so thinking about self-awareness, are we thinking about how that child is viewing themselves as they're separate from others? And that's going to continue to develop throughout their childhood. Them understanding that their own self-esteem can be developed, and they're thinking about how others see them as well. Next, we have self-concept, and it's that knowledge that that child acquires about themselves, and so they're receiving that information from others. And so whether it's their physical appearance, their abilities, their gender, their intellectual ability, that's something that they are determining, is it satisfactory? If I'm being compared to that individual student that's next to me or my sibling, that's something that's going to impact that child's self-concept and their behavior as well. Next, we think about self-control and looking at how they are controlling their own impulses, how they're tolerating frustration, and whether or not they need that immediate gratification. I think that's one thing in our society that, we look for immediate gratification. If the computer doesn't load immediately, then something's wrong with it, it's broken. And so we, that's something also that we have to, work against, is that sometimes things take time, right? And for kids to develop that self-control as well, it takes time. The expectations that we have for a 3-year-old, or I would say a 36-month-old who's been on this earth, doesn't not always match where they are at developmentally. And so, how can we help kids really think about and help develop the self-control that they have, and providing opportunities to practice that self-control in different activities and situations and games in which we engage. And then another one is self-esteem, and thinking about, how one evaluates this self based on what they've learned about themselves and building that. And finally, it's that self-worth, how they value themselves socially, from a society perspective as well. What significance do I have to the classroom community, to my family, to my community, to my neighborhood as a whole? Does anybody care? Am I valued? And so getting kids to really understand that about themselves. Well, as we enter into this work, it's important for us to think about, do we have, again, that affirming attitude to help develop that self-esteem, that sense of belonging and self-worth? Are we helping empower kids towards optimal growth? Are we helping encourage those feelings of empathy? Because if children aren't allowed to develop empathy, it's definitely going to be hard for adults to have that as well, in developing that mutual respect among themselves, their peers, and adults that they engage with. And so really thinking about that affirming attitude that we're bringing to our work that we're doing.
We're almost at the end time-wise. I'm sorry, Dr. Schaefer.
Okay, no problem. We are change agents, and so we have to move into a new direction. I also want you to think about your stress, and that's my final practice for you, for your administrators, for your leaders. We have primary trauma, there's secondary trauma, and we have to be self-reflective of ourselves and what, things that may come forth, and notice, if we are getting disorganized, distracted, are we becoming angry early? Do we have headaches, body aches? Looking at some of these symptoms and conditions, and do we recognize this in ourselves or in the colleagues that we're working with? And it's important that if we do that, that we notify our turning to our family, our friends, fellow staff, counselors, in order to help us address that. Our own professional wellness is so important. And so it's really important for us to think about that. Think about, the workplace self-care groups, if you have those, what a balanced caseload look like, flex time for scheduling, self-care, having a buddy to work and run with you, whatever that needs to be, using any additional evidence-based practices and therapies in order to help us. So just want you to think of some ways to, feed your soul in a positive way. Here are some examples. They'll be on the PowerPoint as well. And thinking about just having high expectations for yourself, not just professionally, but personally as well, and taking time to enjoy life and enjoying yourself and the family and friends that you have, and the work with the children and families that we have as well. And so,
Okay, thank you. It was a lot to fit in.
yes.
Appreciate that.
So just thank you again for allowing me to be in a space with you and to really thinking about how we're going to be culturally responsive and being able to support the kids that we're working with, the communities that we're in, and supporting ourselves as well. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, and thank you also to Dr. Schaefer and for sharing your time and your expertise and your valuable information for us today. And thank you to everyone else who has been here in attendance for being part of the event. Wanting to make sure that you watch for an email with a link to be able to complete your evaluation for today's conference, including this particular session also. And another separate email about the CEUs for those of you that have requested them. And hopefully we will see you next Friday in the afternoon, where it'll be reverse order with the breakout sessions first and the closing speaker at the end. And as far as with the PowerPoints, I will make sure that people get notification whether it'll be on our website or specifically as emails. I'll have to get that specific question answered. And I know we weren't able to get to absolutely everything and looking at all the concepts. So is there a place that they could contact you if they wanted to? Again, also, Dr. Schaefer?
Yes, I'll add that to the PowerPoint, but I'm at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. If you Google my name, I'm sure it will come up along with my email address, but I will also make sure that's available in the information I share.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And everyone have a good weekend and watch for those emails and hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you all.